It was a quiet Friday evening when Lisa decided to work late at her small suburban law office. The workload had been piling up, and with an important court case looming, she needed uninterrupted time to sift through stacks of files. The office was part of a standalone building, nestled on a street that felt eerily deserted after sundown. It wasn't unusual for her to stay late, but this time, she was completely alone. Her colleagues had left hours ago. The first few hours were uneventful. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead accompanied the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard. Occasionally, the sound of a car passing outside broke the silence. Around 10 p.m., she decided to take a break and stretch her legs. As she walked to the small kitchenette at the back of the office, she noticed something odd, a faint tapping sound coming from the front door. Her heart skipped. The glass door leading to the outside was locked, and the office's blinds were drawn. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment, listening carefully. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was testing to see if anyone was inside. Gathering her courage, Lisa crept toward the door. Peering through the small gap in the blinds, she could barely make out a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, standing perfectly still. Her stomach churned. What could he want at this hour? "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if considering her. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the door handle. Lisa's blood ran cold. She quickly backed away, retreating to her desk where her phone lay. Before she could dial 911, the office phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tense silence like a knife. She nearly jumped out of her skin. The caller ID displayed, "Unknown number." Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" The line was filled with static at first, but then came a low, distorted voice. "Why don't you let me in, Lisa?" Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told him her name. She slammed the phone down and grabbed her cell phone, but before she could make the call, the tapping started again. Harder this time. It sounded impatient, angry. Lisa darted to the back of the office, frantically checking the locks on the side and rear doors. All secure. But when she turned around, her stomach dropped. The lights in the main office flickered and then went out completely, plunging the space into darkness. Her only source of light was the faint glow of her computer monitor. The tapping had stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by her own shaky breathing. She tried to convince herself it was just a power outage and that the man had left. Summoning her courage, she crept back toward the front, her phone flashlight guiding the way. The glass door was now ajar. Lisa froze. She was certain she had locked it earlier. The blinds fluttered slightly as a cold draft seeped through the crack. Her pulse raced as she heard slow, deliberate footsteps somewhere deeper in the office. She ducked into the nearest cubicle, a heart pounding in her chest. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispering her situation to the operator. The operator assured her help was on the way, but that it would take several minutes. The footsteps grew closer, pausing every few seconds as if the intruder was searching for something, or someone. Lisa clamped a hand over her mouth, suppressing a scream as a shadow moved past her hiding spot. The figure stopped just outside the cubicle. She could hear his labored breathing. A loud crash shattered the silence. Lisa's computer screen fell to the floor, its light extinguished. The intruder cursed under his breath, his voice low and guttural. He moved away, distracted by the noise, giving Lisa the chance to slip out of the cubicle and bolt toward the back exit. Her hands fumbled with the lock as adrenaline surged through her. She could hear him turning back, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet. Just as she threw the door open and sprinted into the night, she caught a glimpse of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face partially concealed by a mask. He lunged for her but missed by inches. Lisa didn't stop running until she reached a nearby gas station, where she collapsed inside, sobbing. The attendant called the police, who arrived shortly after. They searched the office but found no sign of the intruder. The only evidence was the shattered computer monitor and the unlocked door. Strangely, the security cameras had been disabled. Someone had cut the wires from the outside. The police never caught the man, and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching her long before that night. She quit her job shortly after and moved to a different city. But she still locks her doors twice every night, and jumps at every strange sound in the dark. Because deep down, she knows he could come back. Late one autumn night, Claire found herself in a situation she had sworn she'd never be in again, alone in the woods. Her friends had convinced her to join their annual cabin retreat deep in the mountains, miles from civilization. But when their final night turned into a drunken game of dares, Claire, ever the skeptic, had been challenged to prove she wasn't scared of the woods. The dare was simple: walk out to the old watchtower a mile from the cabin and bring back something from inside, alone. It started innocently enough. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, Claire trudged through the crunching leaves, her breath visible in the crisp, cold air. The trail was well marked, but the thick canopy above blocked most of the moonlight, leaving her reliant on the narrow beam of her flashlight. The sounds of her friends' laughter faded as she moved deeper into the forest, replaced by the hoot of an owl and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Halfway there, she began to feel it, a strange sensation of being watched. She paused, spinning her flashlight around. The beam illuminated twisted branches and swaying foliage, but nothing unusual. Still, the feeling gnawed at her, a prickling at the back of her neck. She quickened her pace. The watchtower finally came into view, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Its wooden frame was old, weathered, and creaking with every gust of wind. She climbed the steps cautiously, her flashlight revealing graffiti-covered walls and scattered debris inside. A dusty old lantern sat on a rusted table near the edge. Perfect. As she reached for the lantern, her flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged. Claire smacked it against her palm, trying to coax it back to life, but it stayed stubbornly dark. The only light now came from her phone's screen. She fumbled to turn on its flashlight when she heard it. A faint, deliberate crunch of leaves outside the tower. Her blood froze. The woods were silent moments before, eerily so. Now there were footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the base of the tower. "Hello," she called, trying to sound braver than she felt. No response. The footsteps stopped. Claire held her breath, straining to listen, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might give her away. She leaned toward the edge of the tower, peering into the darkness below, when a face emerged from the shadows. Pale, gaunt, with wide, unblinking eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The figure stood motionless, staring up at her. Claire stumbled back, nearly tripping over the table. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging her into near total darkness. Scrambling to retrieve it, she heard the creak of wood, the unmistakable sound of someone ascending the steps. She grabbed her phone and switched on the flashlight, aiming it at the staircase. The light caught nothing but empty stairs. Yet the sound of footsteps persisted, growing louder, closer. Her breath hitched as the final step groaned beneath a weight she couldn't see. Then came the whisper. A rasping, guttural voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Why are you here?" Claire bolted. She tore down the stairs, past the spot where the figure had stood, and sprinted into the forest, branches clawing at her as she ran. She could still hear the footsteps behind her, impossibly fast, keeping pace no matter how hard she pushed herself. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't dare slow down. The cabin lights came into view, a distant beacon of safety. She burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, startling her friends. "What happened?" they asked, their laughter replaced by concern as they saw the terror etched on her face. Between ragged breaths, Claire tried to explain, but her words stumbled over each other. One of her friends went to lock the door, only to pause. Claire," he said, his voice trembling. She turned, following his gaze. On the frosted window pane of the door was a handprint, large, smeared, and dripping with something dark. It hadn't been there moments before. The group spent the night huddled together, weapons of opportunity clutched in shaking hands, but nothing else happened. The next morning, they found the trail back to the watchtower covered in claw-like marks, as if something had been dragged into the woods. Claire left the retreat the moment the sun rose, vowing never to return. She deleted all photos from that weekend, but one image lingered in her mind. Those glowing eyes in the dark, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, she swears she still feels them. It was nearly midnight when Paul parked his truck in the shadowy lot of an abandoned gas station. He'd been driving cross-country for hours, chasing the horizon and the promise of a fresh start in a new state. The road was desolate, the kind of place where the world felt like it stopped existing beyond the reach of your headlights. His phone had no signal, and the fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. The station was a relic of another era. Rusted gas pumps, shattered windows, and faded signs advertising cigarettes for 50 cents a pack. A single flickering light above the entrance cast long, unnatural shadows across the lot. Paul grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing in the stillness. The air was heavy, with the scent of mildew and decay. The convenience store was a husk of its former self. Empty shelves stood like skeletal remains, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. Paul swept his flashlight across the room, spotting a door behind the counter. A hand-painted sign hung above it, reading, "Storage." The hope of finding something, maybe an old gas can or even a phone, propelled him forward. The storage room was cramped, the air thick and stale. Rusted tools, empty crates, and stacks of forgotten newspapers filled the space. But in the far corner, something glinted in the light. A metal jerry can. Relieved, Paul approached it, only to freeze when he heard the sound. Faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere beyond the wall. His pulse quickened as he strained to identify it. Maybe it was a pipe rattling, he thought, trying to dismiss the unease crawling up his spine. But then the tapping stopped and was replaced by something worse. A low, guttural scratching sound, as if nails were dragging across wood. Paul's flashlight flickered. He muttered a curse, smacking it until the beam steadied. The sound continued, moving upward, as if something was climbing the wall behind the room. Suddenly, there was a loud thud above him. Dust rained down from the ceiling as his flashlight flickered again. A second thud followed, then another, each one closer than the last. Whatever was up there wasn't small. Paul backed toward the door, gripping the jerry can like a weapon. Just as he reached the threshold, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. He stood there, muscles coiled, every nerve screaming at him to run. But he didn't. Instead, he made the mistake of looking up. The ceiling had a single vent, its cover hanging loose. Something moved inside, barely visible in the dim light. Paul's flashlight caught it for only a moment. A pale, emaciated face with sunken eyes and a wide, lipless grin. The thing let out a wheezing hiss and began to move, its gaunt limbs contorting as it started to push itself through the vent. Paul didn't wait to see more. He bolted back into the store, slamming the storage room door behind him. He could hear it following, the sound of its body scraping against metal and then slamming into the other side of the door. The wood cracked, and Paul's panic surged. He ran outside, fumbling to open the truck door, the jerry can slipping from his grip. As he climbed inside and locked the doors, he saw it emerge. The thing wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and its skin was a sickly, grayish white. It skittered out of the gas station on all fours like a spider, its movements unnervingly fast. Paul turned the key, praying the engine would start. The creature slammed itself against the passenger side window, its wide grin now inches from his face. The glass cracked under the force. The truck roared to life just as the window gave way. Paul floored the gas pedal, sending the creature sprawling backward into the gravel. His tires squealed as he sped down the empty highway, his rearview mirror showing only darkness. He didn't stop until the sun rose, pulling into a truck stop miles away. Shaking, he tried to explain to the clerk what had happened, but the man only gave him a puzzled look. "There hasn't been a gas station out that way for 20 years, the clerk said. Paul didn't argue. He didn't want to. But as he stepped back outside, he noticed something on the passenger door. Long, deep scratches etched into the metal as if made by claws. From that day forward, Paul never drove at night again. But sometimes, when he's parked on a quiet road, he swears he can hear faint tapping, like nails against glass. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Emily woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Half asleep, she grabbed it, squinting at the screen. The notification was from an unfamiliar app called Live Watch. She didn't remember downloading it. The icon was a generic, grainy, black and white image of a camera. Curiosity outweighed caution. Emily tapped on the notification and the app launched to reveal a live video feed. The angle was strange, as if someone had placed a camera on the floor, pointing slightly upward. The room was dimly lit, but she recognized it immediately. It was her living room. Her stomach dropped. Emily froze, staring at the screen. Her heart hammered in her chest as she strained to process what she was seeing. The camera's feed was definitely inside her house, and she was alone. She hadn't installed any cameras, let alone downloaded a surveillance app. She thought it might be a prank. Maybe her ex, someone with access to her Wi-Fi, but that didn't explain the app's presence on her phone. She decided to test it. Moving quietly, she crept out of bed and tiptoed to the edge of the hallway leading to the living room. The room looked exactly as it did in the feed. Dimly lit, eerily quiet, the faint hum of her refrigerator the only sound. She glanced at her phone. The live feed was still there, showing the exact same room, but now there was something different. In the bottom left corner of the screen, she saw movement, a shadow flickering just out of frame. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She pointed her phone toward the area the camera seemed to be focused on, her hands trembling. There was nothing there. The room was empty. She retreated back to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She stared at the phone, trying to think of what to do. She couldn't call the police. What would she tell them? That an app she didn't download was showing her own house in real time? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her spiral. Shh! New viewer joined. Emily stared at the notification, her blood running cold. The screen now displayed a viewer count in the corner. 1. Her fingers hovered over the app, debating whether to close it. But before she could decide, the camera feed glitched for a second, distorting into static. When it came back, the angle had changed. Now it was higher, as if the camera had moved closer to eye level. The view shifted slightly, and Emily's stomach churned. The camera was now pointing directly down the hallway. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The app buzzed again. New viewer joined. Viewer count 2. Emily's phone screen flashed to black, and text appeared in the same grainy font as the app's icon. Do you see me? Her bedroom doorknob rattled. The sound was faint at first, then more insistent. Emily dropped the phone, backing away from the door. The rattling stopped, and an eerie silence filled the room. She crouched by her bed, clutching a metal lamp as a weapon, every muscle in her body tense. Her phone buzzed again, louder this time. She didn't want to look, but couldn't resist. Picking it up with trembling hands, she saw the live feed had returned, but now it was streaming her bedroom. The angle was tilted, as if the camera was on the floor, and she could see herself on the screen, crouched with the lamp in hand. Behind her, in the corner of the room, a figure moved. Emily spun around, swinging the lamp wildly. It hit nothing but air. The corner was empty, but on her phone, the figure remained. Tall, shadowy, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. The last thing she saw before her phone screen went black was the viewer count climbing rapidly. 10, 50, 100. Ta! Emily wasn't found until days later when a coworker reported her missing. The police discovered her phone, but the app was gone. Her bedroom door was still locked from the inside, and nothing appeared out of place, except the strange scratch-like marks on the walls, all radiating outward from the corner. No one has been able to explain what happened to Emily, but some nights, in certain corners of the internet, a strange live stream still appears. A feed of an empty room, a flickering viewer count climbing steadily higher, and in the shadows, just barely visible, a faint pair of glowing eyes. It was the dead of winter, and Hannah was house-sitting for a family friend in a remote countryside home. Surrounded by miles of empty fields and dense forest, the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. She had agreed to stay there for a week, taking care of their dog, Toby, a golden retriever who never left her side. The first few days were uneventful. She kept busy by reading, cooking, and taking Toby on short walks through the frosty fields. At night, the house creaked and groaned like old houses do, but she brushed it off as the cold settling into the wooden beams. On the fourth night, something changed. Hannah was sitting on the couch watching TV when Toby's ears perked up. He let out a low growl, staring at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked, her voice a nervous whisper. The backyard was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. She peered outside but saw nothing. Toby, however, didn't stop growling. His eyes followed something she couldn't see, his body tense. She told herself it was just a deer or a stray dog and went to bed, locking the doors and windows. Toby settled on the floor at the foot of her bed, but his restless growls continued into the night. At 3:17 a.m., Hannah woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they creaked across the wooden floor downstairs. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The house was locked, and no one else was supposed to be there. She reached for her phone, only to realize it was downstairs on the kitchen counter. Cursing herself, she stayed still, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then she heard something worse, a soft, almost playful tapping on the bedroom door. Toby stood up, growling low in his throat. The tapping continued, irregular and taunting. Summoning her courage, Hannah whispered, "Who's there?" No response. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, "Let me in." It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was too quiet, almost childish, but with a strange distortion, like it wasn't used to speaking. Toby barked, loud and vicious, and the tapping returned, faster, harder, almost frantic. Hannah grabbed a heavy lamp from the nightstand and held it like a weapon. "I'm calling the police," she yelled, hoping to scare them off. The voice giggled, a dry, rasping sound. Then it said, "There's no signal out here." Her stomach dropped. The tapping stopped again, replaced by a long, drawn-out scratching sound, like nails dragging down the wooden door. Hannah couldn't breathe. Toby barked again, but this time he started backing away, his tail tucked between his legs. Suddenly, the scratching stopped and the door handle rattled. The lock held, but the handle twisted and jerked violently. Hannah screamed, clutching the lamp tighter. "Go away!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The rattling stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then she heard the footsteps again, retreating down the stairs. She waited, heart hammering, until she was sure they were gone. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, she cracked the door open, lamp in hand. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. She crept down the stairs, Toby sticking close to her side, his fur bristling. The front door was still locked, the windows untouched. But when she reached the sliding glass door, her blood ran cold. On the outside of the frosted glass, a handprint was smeared across the surface, the fingers impossibly long and thin, ending in sharp points. Below it, written in the condensation, were two words, "See you." Hannah didn't sleep the rest of the night. She barricaded herself in the bedroom with Toby and left the house as soon as the sun rose. She never told the family what happened, but she refused to house sit for them, or anyone, ever again. Months later, back in her apartment in the city, she was scrolling through her phone when a notification appeared. It was a photo attachment from an unknown number. Her breath hitched as she opened it. The image showed her asleep in her own bed, and in the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure, thin, pale, with fingers that stretched impossibly long. Below the image was a single message: "I told you I'd see you." It was the perfect storm. A new house, a stormy night, and a power outage. Sarah had just moved into the old Victorian home a week ago, a fixer-upper she bought at a bargain price. The house had character, the realtor had said, with its creaky floors and vintage charm. She saw potential. What she didn't see were the warnings. That night, the storm hit hard. Howling winds rattled the windows and rain lashed against the walls. Around 11 p.m., the lights flickered twice and then went out completely. Sarah grabbed a flashlight, the narrow beam casting eerie shadows across the ornate wallpaper and antique furniture. She was in the middle of unpacking when she heard it. A faint knock, barely audible over the storm. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the front door. She froze. Who would be out in this weather? Maybe it was a neighbor, she thought, coming to check in. Flashlight in hand, she cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. Her heart rate quickened. She opened the door just a crack, the chain still in place. The porch was empty, the only sound the relentless rain hitting the roof. She shut the door, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. A minute later, the knocking returned. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah's hands shook as she checked the peephole again. Still no one. But this time something felt off. She stepped back, closing the flashlight beam on the door. That's when she saw it. A wet footprint, just one, in the center of her living room floor. Her breath hitched. The footprint was bare, wide, and large, as if left by someone standing motionless in the center of the room. She shone the flashlight around, but nothing else seemed disturbed. The knocking stopped, replaced by a dragging sound, faint and distant, coming from upstairs. No one was supposed to be upstairs. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Sarah debated calling the police, but her phone was in the kitchen, and the thought of crossing the dark house made her skin crawl. Against her better judgment, she crept toward the staircase, the beam of her flashlight bouncing as her shaking hand betrayed her nerves. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The dragging sound stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning under her weight. The air grew colder as she reached the landing, her breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. She swung the light across the hallway. The door to the master bedroom, which she distinctly remembered closing, was now wide open. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the door. The flashlight revealed her half-unpacked boxes, the bed frame leaning against the wall, and nothing else. Relieved, she turned to leave when she saw it. A mirror in the corner of the room, one she hadn't noticed before. Its glass was cloudy, warped, and old. But in its reflection, something moved. Sarah whipped around, the flashlight shaking wildly, but the room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, and there it was, a figure. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and an impossibly wide grin. Its bony fingers stretched toward her reflection, the tips nearly brushing her shoulder. Her scream caught in her throat as the mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the glass. The figure vanished, replaced by her terrified reflection. She ran, stumbling down the stairs, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The dragging sound returned, this time accompanied by faint, rasping laughter. Reaching the front door, Sarah yanked it open, only to stop dead in her tracks. A single word was scrawled across the inside of the door in dripping black letters. "Stay!" Ignoring the message, she fled into the storm, running blindly until she reached her car. She didn't look back as she sped away, leaving the house behind. The next morning, the police found her sitting in her car at a gas station, shaking and incoherent. When they went to check the house, they found no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no damage, except for one thing. The mirror in the master bedroom was shattered, and on the fractured glass in jagged, scrawled letters was a single word: mine. Sarah never went back. The house remained unsold, its windows dark and its doors locked. But sometimes late at night, neighbors say they see a light in the upstairs bedroom and a shadow moving, reflected in the cracked glass of the old mirror. It started with the smell. Alex had rented the small cabin deep in the woods for a weekend of solitude. He wanted to escape the chaos of the city, to disconnect from his phone, and to finish the novel he'd been struggling to write. The cabin was cheap, a little too cheap, but he chalked it up to its remote location. Nestled in the heart of a dense forest, the nearest town was nearly an hour away. The first night was uneventful. The cabin was rustic, with creaky floorboards and an old stone fireplace. The wind howled outside, but Alex found the isolation comforting. By the second night, however, the atmosphere began to shift. As he sat at the small wooden desk near the window, typing away on his laptop, a faint odor wafted through the cabin. It was sharp and metallic, like rusted iron mixed with something foul. Decay. Alex wrinkled his nose, dismissing it as the old plumbing, or perhaps something rotting in the forest outside. But the smell grew stronger. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even under the furniture, but found nothing unusual. Frustrated, he returned to his work, opening a window slightly to let in fresh air. That's when he heard it, a faint scraping noise like nails dragging across wood. It came from the front porch. Alex froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive it felt alive. He tried to rationalize it, probably just a tree branch blown by the wind. But when he peeked out the window, the porch was empty. The forest beyond loomed, its shadows impossibly dark. He locked the door before going to bed, reassuring himself it was nothing. But his sleep was restless, plagued by dreams of something watching him from the woods. The next morning, Alex stepped outside to stretch, only to notice something strange on the porch, deep gouges in the wooden planks. They were spaced like claw marks, long and deliberate. A chill ran down his spine, but he dismissed it. Maybe a bear, he thought, though the marks looked too precise, too calculated. By the third night, Alex was on edge. The smell had returned, stronger than ever, and the cabin felt stifling. He lit a fire in the hearth to dispel the cold creeping into his bones. The flames cast flickering shadows across the walls, shapes that seemed to move on their own. As he stared at the fire, a sound broke the silence, a sharp, deliberate knock at the front door. He stiffened. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? Slowly he approached the door, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Alex hesitated before opening the door, only to find no one there. The porch was empty, the forest beyond eerily still. But as he looked down, his stomach turned. In the snow just beyond the porch steps were footprints. Bare, human footprints leading away from the cabin and vanishing into the trees. He slammed the door shut, locking it and dragging a heavy dresser in front of it for good measure. His hands shook as he grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it tightly as he backed into the living room. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. Then came the scratching. This time it wasn't from the porch, it was inside the cabin. Alex spun around, knife raised, but saw nothing. The sound came again, louder, closer, scraping against the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere, surrounding him. He backed toward the corner of the room, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and then he saw it. Emerging from the shadows near the hallway was a figure. Its body was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human visage, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly and a mouth stretched into a sickening grin. Its fingers ended in long, sharp claws that scraped against the floor as it crawled toward him. Alex screamed, stumbling backward. The thing stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. Then, in a voice that was both high-pitched and guttural, it whispered, "You invited me." The room plunged into darkness as the fire went out. Alex's screams echoed through the cabin, and then silence. When authorities arrived days later, the cabin was empty. Alex's car was still parked outside, his belongings untouched. The only sign of him was a single message scratched into the wall above the fireplace. "I am still here." The cabin remains vacant to this day, but locals swear they see lights flickering inside on stormy nights. And if you stand close enough, some say you can still smell it, that sharp metallic tang of rusted iron and decay. The old gas station sat on the edge of a forgotten highway, miles from the nearest town. Rachel had been driving all day, heading home from a road trip when her car's gaslight blinked on. With no other options in sight, she pulled into the station. The place looked abandoned, the neon sign above the building flickering weakly. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement, and the only light came from a single bulb swinging above the pump. Rachel hesitated before stepping out of her car. The air was eerily still, the only sound the faint hum of the buzzing bulb. She approached the pump, card in hand, and was relieved to see that it still seemed operational. As the gas began to flow, she noticed something strange. The windows of the station were completely blacked out, not dark from the lack of light, but as if painted over. Her unease grew, but she told herself to relax. She was tired and imagining things. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. She replaced the nozzle and turned toward her car when she noticed it. Someone was standing behind the glass of the station's door. Rachel froze, her heart pounding. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't react in any way. It just stood there, staring, or so it seemed. The glass was dark, making it impossible to see a face. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The figure didn't move. She hurried back to her car, locking the doors as soon as she was inside. She started the engine, glancing nervously at the station's door. The figure was gone. Rachel peeled out of the lot, her headlights cutting through the dark. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the forest on either side dense and shadowed. She tried to shake the encounter from her mind, chalking it up to a trick of the light or her imagination. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Startled, she glanced at it. She had no signal, so how was she getting a notification? The screen lit up with a message, "You left too soon." Her blood ran cold. The sender was blank. Before she could process it, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, plunging the road into darkness. Panic surged as she tried to restart the car, but it was dead. She was stranded. Rachel grabbed her phone, hoping for any signal, but the screen remained blank. Then she heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel road behind her. She locked the doors, peering into the rearview mirror. At first, she saw nothing. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same silhouette from the gas station, tall, unnervingly still, and now impossibly closer. The figure stopped a few feet from her car, just out of the range of the faint moonlight. She couldn't see its face, only the vague shape of a head cocked at an unnatural angle. Rachel's breathing grew ragged as she fumbled for her phone, trying to call for help despite the lack of service. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. The car filled with an acrid smell like burnt plastic and metal. The windows fogged up instantly, and the faint outline of handprints began to appear on the glass inside the car. Rachel screamed, slamming her fist against the horn, but it emitted only a weak, distorted sound. The figure outside took a step closer, and then another, until it was directly beside her door. Slowly, it leaned down, its face finally visible through the fogged glass. There was no face, just a featureless void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, black as the space between stars. It lingered for a moment before placing a hand, long, thin, and impossibly bony, on the window, and then it whispered, though she couldn't hear it. She felt it, a voice in her head, cold and hollow. "I'll drive now." When Rachel was found the next morning, her car was parked neatly at the side of the road, keys in the ignition. She was gone, her phone resting on the driver's seat with one final message displayed on the screen. "Home is closer than you think." The car started perfectly for the tow truck driver, but he noticed something strange. No matter how many times he wiped the inside of the driver's window, a single ghostly handprint always reappeared. It was a rainy Thursday night when Liam's train broke down in the middle of nowhere. The announcement over the intercom had been apologetic but unhelpful. Due to technical difficulties, this train will be delayed indefinitely. Passengers were given the option to wait or disembark at a small, unstaffed station nearby. Liam, impatient and eager to get home, chose the latter. He figured he could call a rideshare from the station and be on his way. The station was desolate, illuminated by a single flickering bulb that cast weak, uneven light over the platform. The rain had picked up, turning into a relentless downpour that soaked him within minutes. He pulled out his phone to order a ride, but of course there was no signal. The station was little more than a roof over a bench, with a set of stairs leading down to the road. No town, no houses, just trees and darkness. Sighing, Liam decided to wait for the next train, whenever it might come. As he paced the platform, a sound caught his attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far end. His first thought was that it was the rain, but this was too steady, too deliberate. Curious but wary, he walked toward the sound. At the edge of the platform, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, a figure stood in the shadows. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman. She wore an old-fashioned dress that hung heavily with rainwater, and her hair was matted against her pale face. She was barefoot, her feet making the soft tapping sound as they struck the wet concrete. Are you okay?" Liam called out, his voice uncertain. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head, as if studying him, then pointed toward the stairs leading down to the road. Liam felt a chill creep up his spine. "Do you need help?" he asked again, louder this time. Still no response. Then, in one jerky motion, she turned and began walking down the stairs, disappearing into the darkness below. The tapping of her feet faded with each step. Against his better judgment, Liam followed. Something about the woman unsettled him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be in trouble. His sneakers squeaked on the wet steps as he descended, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. When he reached the bottom, he found himself on a narrow, deserted road flanked by thick woods. The woman was nowhere to be seen. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the rain and trees. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flash of white in the forest. She was there, standing just inside the tree line, still pointing. This time, she pointed at him. Liam's heart raced. Something wasn't right. The way she moved, the way she stared without blinking, it wasn't natural. He backed away, only to trip over something on the ground. Looking down, he saw an old, rusted train conductor's hat lying in the mud. Before he could process this, the woman stepped out of the forest. Her movements were no longer slow or jerky. They were quick, deliberate, as she closed the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Liam stumbled back, panic overtaking him. "Stay away," he shouted, but she didn't stop. Her eyes were empty, black pits, her mouth stretching into an unnatural, gaping grin. He turned and ran back toward the platform, slipping and sliding on the wet steps. The tapping sound was louder now, echoing in his ears as if it were right behind him. When he reached the platform, the flickering light overhead went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. The tapping stopped. Breathing hard, Liam turned, his phone's flashlight trembling in his hand. There was no one there, just rain and the sound of his pounding heart. Suddenly, the train's headlights appeared in the distance, accompanied by the rumble of wheels on tracks. Relief washed over him as the train slowed to a stop. He climbed aboard, eager to leave the eerie station behind. As he found a seat, he glanced out the window. The platform was empty, except for one thing: the woman's face, pressed against the glass. Her black eyes locked onto his as her mouth formed a single word he couldn't hear but instinctively understood: stay. The train pulled away, and she disappeared into the darkness. Liam never took the train again, but sometimes on quiet nights he swears he hears the faint sound of tapping outside his window, soft, rhythmic, and deliberate.